My favorite author is F. Scott Fitzgerald, and one of his short stories is called A Diamond as Big as the Ritz. And it captures the tale of a young man who's off at boarding school and meets a friend his sophomore year who takes him home to his family's estate in Montana. And it turns out that this family's wealth, the reason that the kid could go to boarding school, was that they were sitting on a mountain that had a diamond in it that was quite literally the size of a Ritz-Carlton hotel. And, you know, the moral of that story, I won't give away the ending, but the moral of the story is what do you do with wealth of that size? In the song by the same name by Jimmy Buffett, he says, you've got a diamond as big as the Ritz. What you gonna do with it? You know, just lays it kind of flat out. I mean, even with all of that wealth, with everything that you have, there's a lot of problems that come with it. You know, if you cash it in immediately, if you try and sell it, then, you know, you might get one payoff, but money is not everything. And if you try and hold on to it, people are going to come after it. And times are going to get hard, and you've got to be prepared to deal with that. And with C.C. Slaughter and the Lazy S Ranch, which he had set up as a living insurance policy, you have to think that he's setting his children up to fight those fights, take on those battles. Whatever may come, they're going to have to be prepared to, you know, fight it out and keep that land. Or, you know, take the easy route and sell it. And, you know, he tried to make it indivisible. He tried to implement, you know, good practices. He left them with everything they would need for this ranch to succeed. But, you know, unfortunately, this is not called the positive legacy of the Lazy S Ranch. This is called the fall of the Lazy S Ranch for a reason, because unfortunately the Lazy S Ranch did not live much longer than the Colonel himself. And so that's the focus of today's episode, is we're going to get into what exactly happened when the Lazy S Ranch's management was turned over to Slaughter's descendants. So stick with me and we'll get into the details right after a quick message. Hey everyone, wanted to take a quick second to recommend another podcast to you. If you listen to this podcast all the time, then you will love my friend J. Ryan Chastain's Behind the Horse's Eyes podcast. He's been called the Horse King of TikTok, the Horse Daddy of TikTok, I believe is another name. And he has a weekly podcast where he covers all the hot topics in the horse industry. I recommend you check it out for great guests and great information, but I also recommend you check out his social media, including his TikTok, for lots of entertaining takes on not only the horse industry, he'll do Q&As in there, and also TikTok trends as well. So if you like this podcast, if you like what I do here at The Rancher, you'll love Jay Ryan's podcast and his TikTok channel. He just launched some merch, so if you want to go and check that out as well, you can. But wanted to plug him real quick because he is doing a great job with a funny show that everyone in the industry and everyone who has a passion for ranching and horses would really appreciate. So go check out Behind the Horse's Eyes with J. Ryan Chastain. You know, they say that Rome wasn't built in a day, and I think the flip side of that is that it also wasn't destroyed in a day either. Rarely do we find ourselves facing major destruction based off of just one decision. That one decision might be the straw that broke the camel's back. It might be the thing that is just the end of the line, but rarely do we find ourselves in a position where one small thing leads to full-on catastrophe. It's typically a long road. And while I don't think that you can necessarily consider what happened to the Lazy S Ranch to be a catastrophe, it's definitely something that you would consider, just a shame. The fact that a ranch was established for a family to live off of for eternity, in perpetuity essentially, and barely even made it a quarter of a century is it's just sad to think about. As I mentioned in the intro to this episode, the diamond as big as the rich that was the Lazy S, was something that was probably worth protecting, and we'll get into what it would be valued at today later in the episode. But just small little accidents, misfortunes, and overall mismanagement led to the Lazy S Ranch coming to an end far, far, far before its time. Within a decade of the Colonel's death, the family was pitted against itself, and his living perpetual insurance policy was dying. But I think we need to start this episode where we left off the last time, which was at the first ever meeting of the board of the Lazy S Ranch. So let's start there. It was in January of 1902 that the Colonel made good on his promise and made the Lazy S Ranch the living insurance policy that it was always designed to be, by making his descendants the stockholders in the ranch. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to put up a little graph that I made of his family tree with all of his descendants. And quickly, we need to go through this because it's kind of our cast of characters, if you will, for this episode, because his children and his current wife were going to play a major role in what happened with the Lazy S Ranch. So we'll start with Cynthia Ann Jewell's marriage to C.C. Slaughter, which she passed away in 1876, but before then they did have 6 children, one of which did pass away quite early, Eugene. But there was also George Morgan, Robert Lee, Minnie, Della, and Edgar Dick. And then with his current wife, Carrie Averill, who he married in 1876, there was C.C. Jr., Carrie Rebecca, William Webb, Nell Louise, and Alexander. So it'll be important to consult this, and I'll continue to put it up throughout the YouTube videos to remind you, but these will be the main characters in this story, as they were the stockholders and on the board of the Lazy S Ranch. To get an even better understanding of the sons that C.C. Slaughter put in charge and the family dynamics in general, I'm going to read a little passage from Murrow's book, The Rise and Fall of the Lazy S Ranch, and here's what he says about the family. The Slaughter sons were well educated and seemingly well qualified to manage a large ranch. By that time, January 1902, George was nearly 40 and Bob 32. They were experienced ranch managers who had worked for their father. George had graduated from military school in North Carolina before he started work on his father's Running Water Ranch in 1890, and Robert Lee, better known as Bob Slaughter, went to work at age 18 as manager of the Long S in 1888, and was thus educated in the saddle. The third son, E. Dick Slaughter, was 28, a graduate of the University of Texas in 1895, and had been working in the Colonel's Dallas office since 1897. The other 6 stockholders were Colonel Slaughter's wife, Carrie Averill Slaughter, and daughters, Minnie, Della, Carrie, and Nell, and the youngest son, Alexander. Minnie, who in 1902 was 38, and Della, 36, both grew up as belles in Dallas society and attended finishing school at Staunton, Virginia, possibly at the prestigious Augusta Female Seminary. Minnie had married a prominent Dallas doctor, George T. Veal, in January of 1889, and Della had married Dallas attorney Gilbert G. Wright in what was one of Dallas's most lavish weddings in November of 1885. The 2 youngest daughters, Carrie, 19, and Nell, 10, were away at school or at home in 1902. Carrie, who would soon marry John Henry Dean in 1905, and Nell, who wed Ira P. Deloche in 1913. All four of the sons-in-law would play prominent roles in the future Slaughter affairs, and by 1902, Wright was already handling the Colonel's legal matters. In 1902 as well, the two youngest of the stockholders, which were C.C. Jr. and Alexander, were 22 and 20, and both enrolled at Baylor University in Waco. C.C. Jr. graduated in 1902 and Alex in 1905. So as you can see, the sons of Colonel Slaughter and his daughters and their husbands were all very capable and very well-educated folks. And, perhaps that plays into what happens to the Lazy S Ranch. One of the key points of contention in what happens with the ranch and in Slaughter's goals were, what was his intention with this piece of property? Because if you were in Slaughter's position and you had these children, would you want there to be a unlimited amount of money just given to them with no responsibility for as long as they shall live, or did you want them to have to work for it? Because if it was the former, then he didn't do the right thing, because he gave them enough rope to hang themselves, if you will, because they were not able to continuously profit off of this. And there's way better ways to do it. You could hire an independent third party that have a fiduciary responsibility, and they could manage the ranch and just send your kids the mailbox money. But if you wanted to get them involved in this, the Colonel was a devout Baptist, and maybe he viewed it the same way that God views us. He gives us life, and he gives us the free will to make good and bad decisions. And it is from that free will that the real love, our love for God, is supposed to come from. And so maybe the Colonel felt that giving this over to his children for them to manage would make them more likely to love it, to have passion for it, to feel like they had earned the money, and in turn fall in love with him, their father. And if that was the case, it certainly isn't the easy option, and it entailed a lot of trust, a lot of trust in the knowledge that they had, and it involved a lot of working things out between family members. But all in all, the venture was successful while the Colonel was alive, and George was a very skilled businessman and a cattleman, and with Hiley Boyd helping him along with his brother Bob, they were a pretty good team to tackle the fickle West Texas weather, and they managed to provide a pretty solid output out of the ranch for the first few years, which maybe lulled the others into a false sense of security. I mentioned the false sense of security because managing West Texas rangeland isn't as easy as you might think, and especially if you're living your whole life in Dallas in the city, you might not understand just how crazy things can get, how unexpected the weather is, how quickly droughts can overtake your herds. All of these things, it seems like the environment was just designed to fight you. If there's too much rain, then the area will flood or make it more susceptible to frost in the winter. If there's too little rain, it'll burn uncontrolled or, starve your cattle. So there's all kinds of issues. Another one that would pop up in the West Texas area was the dreaded scabies disease, which the Merck Vet Manual describes it as a highly contagious disease that is spread by direct contact between infested and naive animals or by contaminated fomites. Lesions caused by burrowing mite start on the head, neck, and shoulders and can spread to other parts of the body. The whole body may be involved in 6 weeks. So Scabies is a really bad disease. It's something that we try really hard to eradicate these days. But similar to ticky cattle that were coming up the Chisholm Trail, these were a huge issue for folks that ran cattle operations, because you essentially had to quarantine your cattle because no one wanted them anywhere near theirs. They didn't want to let scabies spread. So to solve the issue, the slaughters actually built dipping tanks that were similar to the ones that were used by folks in South Texas to kill off ticks, and they would help make these cattle healthy again. And Murr actually points out that this was no small effort, and by 1916, it was actually the single largest expense that the ranch had, which is an important detail to remember. So for the first 8 years, the colonel was actually very heavily involved. So from 1902 to 1910, he worked really hard with his son George and Bob and the hired hands like Hiley Boyd to give the ranch a good solid start. And finally, in 1910, he fully gave over the reins of the Lazy S to his children, which were the stockholders. And one of his sons, Dick, had actually left working for his father because he had likely embezzled money from one of the companies. There was a large hole in the books that he had been managing, and his father essentially sent him away, and he was not able to work there, but he was still a stockholder because he was a son. And immediately after the colonel turned over the ranch to the stockholders, he immediately brought forth a motion to rewrite the rules that would allow him to sell that stock at his own discretion instead of having to wait until all of the stockholders, which were his siblings, to pass on. So immediately, we see the struggles, the trials, the difficulties of keeping families on the same page when it comes to financial decisions and responsibilities. The motion was ultimately voted down, but it's just a fascinating snapshot that you give someone an inch, you give them their access to this insurance policy, and they immediately want to make their own decisions with it. And it's something that helps you tell early on that not all of his children were on the same page. And if the colonel wanted this thing to work, he needed what he had done, what he had set up, to be essentially airtight. There also became a really stereotypical rift between the older brothers, George and Bob, and the youngest brothers, Dick, Alex, and Cece Jr. And I mean, it's just so typical that I'm sure you could guess, but essentially the younger brothers, who were essentially chained to their desks across the street from their father working in Dallas, were micromanaging what George and Bob were doing out on the ranch, even though they had little to no experience working on ranches, and essentially were doing it just because they were busybodies who wanted to make their brothers' lives harder. And I mean, they were calling board meetings at a rate of almost once every 2 weeks in 1912, which is in itself absurd, but their use of this time was even crazier because they would spend the meetings drafting nonstop complaints against their older brothers and just playing busy. They were questioning the salary that the brothers were taking for working on the ranch, even though they were not getting paid nearly as much as what the stockholders were about to pay themselves. They paid themselves very handsomely that first year. Since George and Bob were unable to attend the 1912 meeting because they were, of course, working on the ranch, in their absence, the younger brothers approved a $90,000 worth of dividends to be paid out to the stockholders. That's equivalent to about $2.6 million, which was split between the 10 or so members of the board, the stockholders. So just think about that. I mean, that is a ton of money to be making off 1 year. I mean, this is supposed to be an insurance policy, not, not your everyday salary. But for these young men and their wives and the sisters and their husbands, I mean, they saw the money and they wanted to take it. They even tried to sell off the Hereford home in Roswell, New Mexico, because, in their eyes, it was not making a profit. But, if you remember, that was not the point of the Hereford home. They bought the Hereford home in Roswell so that they could do two things. They could have a quality climate for their prized bulls like Sir Breton and Sir Bredwell, or Ancient Britain and Sir Bredwell. And, most importantly, it was alfalfa that could help hedge against the drought in West Texas. They had a full alfalfa farm that they could bring in, feed from to their West Texas ranches. So they were essentially burning a candle at both ends. They were taking all the money that was made, and they were also trying to sell off the important inputs. So, they were treating it like a personal checkbook that was never going to run dry. But if you know anything about the cattle business, you know that there are good years and there are bad years. And similar to the stock market, how every year has a different percentage change. Some are good, some are bad, but typically it pans out to about 8% over a 10-year period. Obviously that number is different from ranch to ranch, but 8% in the stock market is, typically a standard number. So even if the Lazy S Ranch had a good year and you could take out $90,000, that's not going to be a guaranteed number every single year. So when you apply that logic, the younger brothers were taking everything they could out of it, and they weren't hedging for the next bad year. Imagine if there was a negative return year. If they dipped into the red, I guarantee that those boys were not going to cough up any of the money to make the books go back to zero. So in 1913, again, another pretty good year. The colonel's still alive. George is still managing the ranch. They pushed the payout to $100,000. So not keeping it the same at $90,000. They moved it up another $10,000. Basically 10%. So instead of saving, the board was deciding that they should get paid out, and that they also needed to do some improvements to the ranch in 1915. So, I think that that's probably a fairly wise decision, and they started replacing fences, working on eradicating scabies, taking out the weeds that were growing rampant, and also building a headquarters on the ranch. And of course, in typical Slaughter family fashion, all of these projects were going over budget, including the ranch headquarters, which, when all was said and done, actually cost double the projected cost. But all of these things, could be overcome under the strong guidance of their old brother George. Him and his father were very adept and really just passionate about the industry, knew what they were doing, and could keep things afloat. So the family was growing used to living off these successes, and they essentially felt that it was par for the course for these successes to continue. They were Slaughters. The colonel was alive. All things were great. George was doing a great job, even though they were writing him up at every turn. So, mailbox money, essentially. Unfortunately for the stockholders of the Lazy S, their fortunes were going to turn in the summer of 1915. In early July, while George was touring the Lazy S Ranch, lightning struck near his automobile, giving him an electrical shock. While the incidents caused George some concern, he did not consider it serious. However, 6 days later, on July 15th, he had just eaten lunch at the ranch mess hall, and Clifton Fitzgerald, the assistant foreman, also known as a straw boss, was there. He said that George got up from the table, told Clifton and the foreman John Lamond to come out to the office for a conference, and made for the short walk. Clifton remembered that as soon as he sat down, he fell over dead. The impact of George's death on the entire Slaughter family was immeasurable. Its greatest was on his wife Allie and their 3 children: George Morgan Jr., who was 18, Joe Dick, who was 14, and Eloise, who was 10. Also, Colonel Slaughter's reaction must have been grievous and long-lasting. George's brothers prepared a memorial for the corporate minutes. To their credit, their statement revealed that George was indeed the heart of the Slaughter family, saying that he was the chain that binds our stockholders together. And this is what it said: "The industry, loyalty, capacity, and ability of George Morgan Slaughter is as well to the stockholders as to the members of the board of directors, and we need not say that every meeting of the board of directors and every time that an important question comes up for discussion, we miss more than we can describe the timely advice, the wise counsel, and the safe judgment of one upon whom we had learned to lean in every danger and in every trial. We feel sure that the stockholders will agree with us that the fitting memorial to his manly life was, 'Well done, thou good and faithful servant.'" So there you have it, the words of the brothers and the other stockholders as to what they felt about their brother George, who had been successfully leading the Lazy S Ranch in the absence of their father and providing them with, fairly good wealth. This was kind of the beginning of the end, if you will. So with the colonel out and their brother George moved on, and it was time for the younger brothers to put their money where their mouth was. Of course, Bob was next in line, and he was going to manage the ranch, but he was actually in the middle of dealing with his own venture down in Sonora, Mexico. So they now were lacking their oldest brother George, and partially their brother Bob, who was busy in Sonora, Mexico, and the colonel was rapidly aging. So the 3 younger brothers that were also busy in other ventures were going to have to step up a little bit, but unfortunately the Lazy S Ranch became no one's full-time priority. And again, if you know anything about the industry, you know that ranching is a full-time job, and when I say full-time job, I mean a 100-hour-week type job, and it's a passion project. You can't do a ranch on the side unless you pay a lot of people to do it full-time. You cannot do it part-time, and it was essentially becoming an orphan, which was kind of funny because at the same time, the small parts that were being attended to were being micromanaged. And one of the great stories that Murrah points out is that the younger brothers were now getting the bills because George had been getting the bills, but now they were being sent directly to Dallas, and they were complaining that the luxurious items of syrup, sauerkraut, and pasta was being purchased by those who lived on the ranch. And of course, the foreman, his wife, did not take too kindly to that. I mean, essentially, think about how big of a slap in the face it would be for these folks who are taking, a giant dividend each year for sitting in Dallas off this ranch, to be upset that you and your family that are doing all the hard work out on the ranch wanted a little bit of syrup and kraut with your beef and hardtack. That just couldn't have sat well with them. And even in the lean years, though, the board continued to give itself these large dividends, and it was really starting to add up. Winter storms, drought, and soaring input prices like scabies eradication all contributed to what became a mounting debt. And unfortunately, in 1919, about 17 years after the ranch had been given over, and almost 10 years after it had been fully given into the management of the children, the colonel, C.C. Slaughter, passed away. So the legend If George was the glue, C.C. Slaughter was the fist that was holding everyone together. He had passed on, and this was going to pave the way for even further division amongst the family. You see, the colonel was leaving behind a fortune valued at $3.2 million in 1919. And when you consider that a third of that was prime Dallas real estate, and the rest of it was dispersed between the banks that he had owned and the ranch lands, it wouldn't even do that number justice to just try and plug it into an inflation calculator and give you a number for today, because there's no way that Dallas real estate can be compared dollar to dollar. It's likely worth 10, 15, 20, 30 times as much as it was at that time. But, as Biggie succinctly put it, mo money, mo problems. If you haven't figured it out by now, the colonel was a very wise man, and in the wake of his death, he knew that his properties would be split up and divided amongst the family, and he knew that, of course, his sons would likely try and start a fight over it. So he put in a fun little stipulation that said that anyone who contested this will would forfeit their share. And of course, anyone in the legal field will say that they could still contest the will and then, of course, contest that provision. It would cost them greatly in legal fees. So a fun little provision that he put in there to keep them from fighting just a little bit. But, his children were very impatient and they wanted that big payday. And so they decided to sell off quite a few of his ventures, including the Long S Ranch, which is not to be confused with the Lazy S, but it was an earlier venture that the colonel had. And, that did not mean that the Lazy S was not on the chopping block. Debts were mounting, and so the children were really interested again in just getting that lump sum. And the more urban inclined section of the family, who had no experience with ranching, really didn't think there was any sense in continuing to dump money into that land out west. So they came up with a plan, which was headed by Nell's husband, Ira Deloche. And here's what Murrah had to say about the plan from Mr. Deloche. Deloche then proposed a plan of division calling for the immediate dissolution of the company and assumption of its debt by the individual stockholders. He also called for the division of all lands and properties and equal division of the livestock. This plan, he argued, would certainly save the stockholders and officers from the sure and dire results that always and inevitably will come in the future to a house divided against itself. No one else had a better alternative. Within a few weeks, a majority of the directors and stockholders were willing to accept Deloche's plan, and in January of 1921, they unanimously elected Deloche as the supervising director of the company to oversee the division of the ranch, and designated Deloche and Bob Slaughter as a committee to work out the details. Deloche and Bob Slaughter promptly went to work to divide the ranch in cattle, and after hiring a professional accountant to survey the ranch, the committee approved a plan that classified the 246 acres of the ranch as 3 classes of land and assigned corresponding values: agricultural, semi-agricultural, or grazing. Then the survey divided the ranch into 10 allotments, varying in size from about 17,000 to as much as 34,000 acres, but equally valued at $195,000. With the audit and valuations in place, the arbiters then placed a description of each of the divisions in 10 capsules, and the stockholders gathered in an attorney's office in Dallas in April of 1921. In a ceremony similar to the one staged the previous year with the division of the Long S, each drew a capsule from a small box, having agreed to accept the random results. However, while preparations were underway for the ranch's division, Potter County, which had sold its 17,000-acre block in central Cochran County to Colonel Slaughter's secret agents in 1898, filed suit to reclaim the land. As a result, the arbiters had to exclude that land from the drawing. But after Slaughters successfully won the suit in November 1921, the Potter County land was also divided 10 ways. Was division the best choice? Obviously, a large ranch could be operated more efficiently than 10 small ones. But, faced with mounting debt and a mistrust of one another, most stockholders felt that they had no other choice. Unfortunately, because the land division was random pick of capsule, the process gave the stockholders no advanced choice to select the type of land they wanted, regardless of whether their interests lay in ranching, farming, or land colonization. And at the time, none of them knew about the rich oil pools that lay under the eastern portion of the ranch, primarily in Hockley County. At the drawing ceremony, Colonel Slaughter's widow, Carrie Averill, drew one of the largest blocks of 34,000 acres. It was the ranch's so-called scraped-out pasture, so named for the hand-dug tanks along the Sulphur Draw, and was considered the poorest of the land for farming. C.C. Jr. drew one of the smaller blocks, 17,000 acres, but it included the magnificent headquarters and land that was more suitable for farming. Dick Slaughter received a 24,000-acre block that ran nearly 15 miles across the central part of Cochran County, and at the time would have been considered to be the prime property. Although the soil was quite sandy, the property was the logical choice for the railroad and for the development of the county seat. Della Slaughter Wright and Carrie Slaughter Dean each received adjacent blocks which lay in the southeastern corner of Cochran County. But because most of Carrie's block included the rough land along the Sulphur Draw, she received approximately 37,000 acres. George Slaughter's wife, Allie, and children, and Nell Slaughter drew adjacent blocks in the northeastern Cochran and northwestern Hockley counties, and they would later manage that property collectively. The property most remote from the headquarters, which lay in central Hockley County, went to Bob Slaughter and Alex Slaughter. Bob's land, which would eventually become known as the Bob Slaughter Block, would later become the site of Sundown, Texas. Alex received the smallest block of land at 14,000 acres, known as the Zavala pasture, which lay south of the present-day town of Leveland. Valued from $13 to $15 per acre, it was considered to be the most valuable land on the ranch. In time, after the discovery of oil, it would also become one of the most valuable properties in West Texas. And there you have it. That was the breakdown of the Slaughter lands and the end of the Lazy S Ranch. The ranch was now divided, and each stockholder now held their land, around 1,200 head of cattle, and $283,000 in debt. The Lazy S Ranch was no more, and the Colonel's plan for a financial dynasty couldn't even last a quarter of a century. With the 10 plots under the 10 different owners, there was a lot that could happen to each of the ranches. Some parts were actually immediately sold, like Minnie Veal's, while C.C. Jr. kept operating a cattle ranch because, of course, he had the luxury of the headquarters on his section. Another part that you mentioned in Murrah's book was that the railroad was starting to come to the area, so many of the heirs were working really hard to make sure that the railroad came right through their section of land, especially in the Hockley and Cochran County areas. Parts of these ranches were sold, but some of the family held on, and even when times became real hard in the 30s, the lands became tenant farms where families who really needed it were leased land from the family to manage their sections. But, in the late 30s, oil was found on the southeastern part of the ranch, and essentially all of the siblings except for C.C. Jr. and George's descendants earned a pretty good sum of money from the oil production that occurred on the land. There are some pretty interesting stories that you'll have to check out in Murrah's book that stem from the sale of the lands. But if you want to hear more about them, you'll have to check out the book. But I find that Murrah's last paragraph on all of this sums it up so well, and that's on page 113, where he says, "Therefore, nearly a century after its division, The lands of the Lazy S were annually producing as much as $100 to $120 million for its owners. Although he never fathomed the impact of oil on the area's economy, Colonel C.C. Slaughter knew the value of large contiguous blocks of land, and it is no wonder that he implored his children to keep the ranch intact as an indivisible living insurance policy. While Murrah's story of the Lazy S Ranch ends in the 1920s with the property being split up, that's not the end of the story for the Slaughter family. A lot of them made quite a bit of money off of the sale of the property and the incoming oil money that would come from that. But, to this day, I actually mentioned this on my Instagram, there is a place that is an event venue in Weatherford, Texas called the Lazy S Hacienda. And while it does not actually sit on the original Lazy S Ranch, it is owned and operated by a descendant of C.C. Slaughter. So, while there might be a little bit of doom and gloom about this story and the splitting up of the ranch and the subsequent sales of it, didn't turn out all that bad for all of the descendants of C.C. Slaughter, and a lot of them are still very active in the industry and successful in ventures like the Lazy S Hacienda, which hosts all kinds of Western industry events. So just wanted to add that to the end there. Wanted to end on a positive note instead of a negative one. And I want to thank you all for listening to this episode. If you would, please comment what you think would be the most interesting ranch for me to do next. I know I have done a lot in Texas and a lot of folks in Texas, and I have some stories about some other ones that I want to get to in other states, but let me know which story you want me to cover next. Are there any of your favorites that I haven't done yet? Also, of course, please feel free to like this page and subscribe. It really helps get the word out and get me into the algorithm on YouTube here. So thank you again for listening, and until next time, God bless and Godspeed.